Hello everyone, my name is Andrew. I'm a software developer and instructor for Angular Bootcamp and Oasis Digital. Today I'm going to talk about Angular CDK drag drop, which is a new feature that was added to CDK Experimental about 1 month ago. So it's currently an experimental feature, but it will eventually become part of the CDK. For those of you who don't know, the CDK is part of the Angular Material project, but it doesn't provide any styling or enforce any look and feel, so you can use the CDK to provide functionality in your templates without requiring you to use Angular Material exactly. You can also use it with Angular Material, of course, but you can use it with any component library that you might want to use. So for this video, I've made an example application that implements a remapping feature. So let me pull that up here. So in this application, the idea is that we have an input object, which is shown in the lower right, and we want to reassign the properties to different um, values that are part of the original group. So here we have a assignment already made where B is being reassigned to A, and we can make other selections here using the drag and drop feature. So I can drag items from available into the new assignment column, and I can drag things between places in the new assignment column as well. And of course I can move items over to the available column to unassign. So as I do this, the output object is updated in the lower right, and the various pieces of the UI are also updated. So this drag and drop here to assign is appears when there's no more items left in that drop site. So let's look at the code for this. To implement this, I used StackBlitz, but there's no reason why it needs to be in StackBlitz. It would also work fine in an Angular CLI project. StackBlitz is just a convenient way to share code. So this application is a pretty much a bare bones Angular application with one component that I made. So the main difference is I'm bringing in the drag drop module from Angular CDK Experimental drag drop. And of course, when this becomes part of CDK proper, it'll be imported from a different location. But for now, it's part of the experimental path. And so in the app component, I am simply instantiating my remapping component. I'm passing it the initial mapping object, and whenever the mapping is updated, an event is fired to update that mapping. I'm showing the new mapping then using the JSON pipe and pre-tags to format it nicely on the screen. That's what appears on the lower right part of the application. So looking at the remapping component, which is where everything is happening, I've split this up into 3 different columns corresponding to the UI. So we have the original assignment column on the left. This is represented by this block. Since there's no dragging and dropping happening here, these are just divs and text being displayed. I'm using the ng4 to iterate over an array, and then using class and style to make the appearance look a certain way. So the next column is the new assignment column, which is the center column of the application. And this is where we see the first use of the drag drop feature. So CDK drag drop exposes the CDK drop component, and this defines a place where you can drag an item into or out of. I call them drop sites. I have given this component a template variable so that I can reference it in the Typescript. And we can notice that the CDK drop component exposes some events. So here I'm using dropped, entered, and exited to update the state of the component when these events happen. And then there are 2 input properties, connected to and data. Connected to defines which other CDK drop components on the template you can drag items into from this component. This is an array of references to CDK drop components. And so if we look at the application, um, the drop site that C is inside of, for example. So the first drop site in the new assignment column is connected to the available drop site as well as this available drop site in the middle column. So that means that I can drag C into this drop site, or I can drag it into the available drop site, but I can't drag it into the last two drop sites since they already have items. Then the data input property takes an array of the values that the drop site contains. And so we'll look at that in a moment. So after you pass in the proper input properties and use the event handlers, you have to actually pass in elements to display in the DOM. So in this case, I am showing a div containing the actual draggable item when an item appears in the drop site. And if there is no item in the drop site, there's a show placeholder array that contains a boolean. And if that's true, then this drag and drop here to assign message is shown. So that's, again, this drag and drop here to assign placeholder. And finally, there's an available column, and this is, of course, the third column in the application. And here I've also given it a template variable name. I'm using one of the event handlers, and I'm passing connected to in data. And finally, I'm also populating the contents of the drop site. So one other thing about this, when you have an item that can be dragged, there are two directives that you can apply to them. So CDK drag is a directive that says this item can be dragged, and CDK drag handle is a directive that says you can click here to drag this item. So they've separated the idea of something that can be dragged from the place where you have to click to drag it. So in the application, you could have like an icon on the right side of this draggable item, for example, and if it had the CDK drag handle directive, you'd have to click on that particular part of the item to move it. In this case, I've applied both directives to the same element, so I can click anywhere in the item to drag it. Okay, and that's all there is to the template. So looking at the Typescript, I'm importing various interfaces from the drag-drop library. And so the first thing I do in my component is I get references to the drop sites in the template. So I use viewChildren to get all of the drop sites in the new assignment column, and viewChild to get the available drop site on the right side. And these, the types for these are going to be CDK drop, which is again available as part of this import, and they have the type of the items that they contain. So in this application, I've defined a type for each draggable item, which is called map item. And this is simply a object with a key and a display name. So I've separated the concept of what the backing data is for the draggable item versus what's shown on the screen. But in this simple application, they're the same. And there are also there is an input for the initial mapping and an output for the updated mapping, which is a simple event emitter. And the mapping type that I've defined is just an index type. So I have string keys and string values, which are null when they haven't been mapped yet. Okay, then there are properties that hold the state of this component. So the original assignments is the items in the leftmost column. New assignments is the middle column. So each drop site takes an array of items. So this is an array of arrays where each inner array can have 0 or 1 items. The available property is contains all of the items in the rightmost column. And then there are two properties for connections. The first connections property is for the center column. And so again, it's an array of arrays since each drop site takes an array of other drop sites it's connected to. And then the available connections is an array for connections from this rightmost column to any other drop sites that it's connected to. And then I have a show placeholder property for whether or not to show the placeholder. Then there's a connect dropsites method. This is a helper method that is called to update the uh, connections and available connections properties based on the current state. So whenever I would drag an item, for example, um, the connect dropsites method is called to update the connections. So now now the available column is not connected to any of these since they're all filled. If I drag this over, available is now connected to this one, but not any of the others. And I have an emit mapping method. This emits the new mapping whenever the user makes a change. So anytime they drop an item, the emit mapping is called to send the mapping back to the parent component. I have an init props method, which sets up the properties when the component is created, and that's called by ng-on-init, which also calls emit mapping as soon as the component is made. And then the final thing that needs to be initialized when the component is made is the connect dropsites, which needs to be called. But you can't actually call this in the ng-on-init since the viewChild and viewChildren haven't been performed yet. That only happens during the viewInit. So they're not available until after viewInit. So we use that component lifecycle hook. And then there's another wrinkle. If we actually called this without using the set timeout, there would be an error because the connect dropsites method actually changes the values of the connected to properties in the template. So the connected to of the new assignment column dropsites and the available column. And that causes a view has changed after it's been checked error. So you have to actually make sure that you do this connect dropsites. You basically have to make sure that you do your template changes in the next event loop tick. So we just to do that we just use a set timeout without any timeout set. So that just assigns this callback to the next event loop tick that's available. Finally, there's a drop method, which is called whenever the user lifts the mouse button up while they're dragging and they have dragged an item into a drop site. So this updates the values of the arrays for the data. So if we look here, the data input property has this new assignments and it has this available property assigned. This drop method updates the values of those arrays. It connects the drop sites, so it updates the connections since a new item has potentially been added to a drop site, making it unavailable. And it also emits the mapping back to the parent component. And finally, there's a helper method to set the show placeholder property. All right. So this looks like a fair bit of code, but the CDK drag drop feature has actually saved us the task of having to handle the drop sites and draggable items. If you were trying to implement this sort of application using the native HTML5 drag and drop feature, you'd have to do all of the housekeeping yourself. The CDK drag drop library, on the other hand, takes care of all that for you. All of this is basically the logic that's specific to this drag and drop application. So I didn't have to handle, any of the nitty gritty of dragging and dropping. Then I also have a styles file, but that's really just defining the look and feel. It doesn't have anything to do with dragging and dropping. So any kind of styling that you want to apply to your application, you can certainly do. The CDK drag drop doesn't enforce any of it. It just exposes components that you can use. All right, and that's all there is to this application. I hope this helps somebody, and thank you for watching.